It all started with a police chase. A Hagerstown, Maryland police vehicle driving on a rainy street skids into a tiny little house. The city condemns the building located on the historically African American Jonathan Street.
I know the police ran into the house. He didn't get no invitation. He didn't have to knock.
During demolition, it's recognized that the modest building has distinctive lineage, and the demolition is stopped. Archaeologists are brought in. It's discovered that the tiny home has roots to the 1700s and the European founder, Jonathan Hager. 417 Jonathan Street becomes a rallying point for the community. Its history is their own. Its survival is theirs. Like Detroit, like Gary, and like hundreds of other cities and towns across America, Hagerstown was once a symbol of American industrial power and of African American commerce and culture. Then the long slide began. Thousands of jobs left Hagerstown. Redlining and disinvestment rocked Jonathan Street. Surrounded by some of the wealthiest counties in America, Hagerstown had become an island of urban ills in a sea of prosperity, and Jonathan Street had become the most notorious street in the rapidly declining city. Despair was palpable. Now, 7 decades after its heyday, Jonathan Street and Hagerstown are trying to stage a comeback, sparked in part by a little log cabin and the feeling of pride and community it has engendered. Hagerstown and Jonathan Street have come to symbolize the economic and racial challenges facing Rust Belt America. Can they also symbolize its rebirth?
It's kind of a classic Mayberry-like small town in the United States. It has a gorgeous downtown plaza and classic kind of Main Street.
It's a community on the mend. It's had a wild ride for the last century plus.
Hagerstown is a place where someone like me, foster care, homelessness, 5 kids by the age of 25, can become the mayor.
And it's a city in a very rural area, so politically speaking, it's in a sea of red.
Mixes a lot of like northern, southern kinds of things. So there's a lot of contradictions, but then a lot of just interesting harmony between people.
A great history as a manufacturing and transportation hub in the United States. It was all the railroads on the monopoly board, Short Line, B&O, all once met in Hagerstown. I mean, it was really a focal point, a gateway to the Midwest.
We had a strong history of Revolutionary War, Civil War, manufacturing, agriculture, now warehousing.
I think Hagerstown in many ways represents the beautiful journey of so many of our cities and towns across this country, and I think Hagerstown has a lot to show the rest of the country on how to navigate it.
Oh my goodness. Hagerstown is good ground.
Hagerstown, Maryland is many things to many people, but all agree that it is quintessentially American. Located within 90 minutes of Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Pittsburgh, it's called the Hub City because of the many rail lines that once converged there. Although most of the rail traffic has long since gone, Hagerstown still remains a hub city because of the interstates that meet there, north and south, east and west. But Hagerstown is also isolated, kept separate from the booming Washington suburbs by the Appalachian Mountains. It's more Midwestern than Mid-Atlantic. Its location also gave it a key role in both the Civil War and the Underground Railroad. The battles of Antietam and Sharpsburg took place right outside Hagerstown. Abolitionist John Brown planned his raid on the Harper's Ferry Armory at this farm right outside of town. Both Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman had a presence here. And today, politically, Hagerstown and Washington County are rural conservative strongholds, out of step with the more populated liberal counties surrounding Baltimore and D.C. Donald Trump carried the county by 30 points in 2016, even staging a rally at the airport. In 2022, the trucker convoy staged their protest at the Hagerstown Speedway. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the area was mostly populated by the Shawnee, an Ohio Valley tribe who were forced into the area following the Iroquois invasion during the Beaver Wars. Later, the Iroquois used the area as hunting grounds. Many residents still revere founder Jonathan Hager, a German settler. Among the many gifts that Hager bestowed on the future residents were the hand-hewn beams that held up the house at 417 Jonathan Street.
All those years, we're walking up and down the street, and there's this tremendous piece of history right before our eyes, and no one knew. No one knew.
Until, in 2018, a police vehicle chasing a car on a rain-slicked Jonathan Street crashed into the siding-covered house. The house, mortally wounded, was, like so many before it, then slated for demolition. The demolition company, owned by Joel Murbaugh and his son, was brought in to tear the house down. Murbaugh, a history buff, was not thrilled with the assignment.
Part of history's gone. It's gone forever. Once it's gone, it's gone. You can't bring it back. You ain't gonna put it back over there. And when I saw them beams sitting like this, and they slide over top of each other, and they're all hewn like that, when I saw those logs, I thought, that thing's super old.
But it reminds everyone that the next time they hear about just one more demolition or it's just an old building, it doesn't matter, is to give pause and think about that little cabin. Because that cabin was just one more demolition, and then we realized that we were tangling with one of the oldest standing structures in Hagerstown.
Another 45 minutes, and then we'd have had it in the truck. And it would have been in the landfill, and it had been gone. And that's what I mean. Once it's gone, it's gone. I didn't want to tear the building down.
Less than a year before, Murbaugh had demolished a derelict historic house down the street at 335, despite community outcry.
That building was really too far gone to be saved. They had waited too long, about 10 years too long.
He then called Reggie Turner, a local financial advisor who, along with his fellow financial advisor Terrence Moore, had tried to stop the demolition of 335.
So as we begin to discuss plans for 335 North Jonathan Street, let's acknowledge that after 30 years of exclusion and disinvestment from the city's historic preservation and revitalization efforts, this body has given us only 3 weeks to formulate a plan.
The work that we started with 335 North Jonathan Street, which was the home of the Moxley Band. Both Green Book sites are no longer there. You had the Harmon Hotel. You also had Ship's Tea Room that was up the street in the 300 block. Both of those Green Book sites are now gone. There were other log structures in the community that have just went by the wayside, and there was just no thought process in regards to keep them.
Yeah, Jonathan Street probably is one of the best snapshots and small case studies in how bad policy can ruin a community.
The city of Hagerstown had a $40,000 preservation study done of the Johnson Street community, identifying all the historic structures, including the log cabin that we've spoke of. 18 years later, they did nothing. So, there's a lot of indictment on our local government, and it's not just our current government. I mean, you can look back over generations of the same type of treatments, and we have gotten to the point of saying no more.
Turner and Moore contacted Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit, who then got in touch with the archaeologists at the State Highway Administration. As the COVID pandemic was raging in the spring of 2020, they began an archaeological dig. What they found was surprising.
Then to find out that the Hager family then owned the property through the first decades of the 19th century, and then that the property changed hands between European Americans until about the 1880s, when it fell under the ownership of an African-American family. And then pretty much it's African-American history from the last decades of the 19th century through the 20th century to today.
As the archaeological dig at 417 Jonathan Street continued, more and more was discovered about the house and the community itself as each layer of the house revealed itself.
I think Jonathan Street does tell a story and holds a lot of information for people across this country who are wondering about how to save a place that matters to them. It's a laboratory for preservation and for how to use historic places to spur reinvestment and build prosperity for a community.
Jonathan Street was the Black Wall Street of Maryland. It was one of the earlier Black communities in the state, but it has been hidden, and we're now blowing the dust off.
Many of the enslaved town originally landed in St. Mary's County in southern Maryland, working on tobacco farms. Some were brought to western Maryland by enslavers who held properties in both regions, but instead of working in the tobacco fields, they worked in places like the Antietam Furnace, often alongside white men. Hagerstown's proximity to slave-holding Virginia and Free State Pennsylvania also made it a natural conduit to freedom for enslaved people who could make it across the Potomac River. Although many succeeded in escaping, the vast majority of enslaved people never tried, unwilling to leave their families behind.
It was wrenching to leave people behind. James Pennington, who is our most famous enslaved person here in Washington County and became a great abolitionist once he reached freedom.
After disregarding the slave name of Pembroke, James Pennington went on to become a pastor and an influential abolitionist. But his freedom came at an enormous cost.
He left parents and many siblings behind in slavery, and some of them eventually got out, some of them with his help, but most of them did not get out. They risked being sold just because he was escaping. And in fact, that was true. Many of them were sold as a punishment or a prevention.
Enslaved people also didn't want to risk recapture and being sent further south.
And we have a lot of cases of that here in Washington County, that you might be sold to the internal slave trade of the United States. And that meant being sold to a place like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, where the crops were cotton and sugar, and the work was dangerous and much harder than in Washington County.
On Jonathan Street, a jail held both criminals and freedom seekers. Enslavers would often post newspaper notices offering rewards for the recapture of runaways. The sheriff of Hagerstown was an active participant in the trafficking.
It's clear to me that enslavers did know that the people they enslaved were human, even though they treated them inhumanely. And I don't know how they reconciled that. I really don't.
Although there were more free African Americans than enslaved, Hagerstown was not overtly abolitionist. Still, elements of resistance grew within communities that opposed slavery. This house in the Jonathan Street community was rumored to be the last stop on the Underground Railroad between Virginia and Pennsylvania. It was owned by Jacob Wheaton, who later became the first Black man in Maryland to vote. Washington County was also the site of a pivotal strike against slavery led by a particularly fervent abolitionist named John Brown.
Intensity is a good way to describe Brown's character. He had a way of mesmerizing you. He was, in many ways, magnetic. And God's mission for Brown is the eradication of an evil. And that evil is slavery in the land of the free. Well, we weren't the land of the free in 1859. We have nearly 4 million human beings in bondage.
Brown eventually found himself called to the tiny Kennedy farm outside Hagerstown, within striking distance of the armory in Harper's Ferry.
And he's chosen Harper's Ferry very specifically because an army needs arms. And Brown has, at the Harper's Ferry Armory and Arsenal, a federal installation where 100,000 weapons are in storage to be used by the United States military forces.
John Brown is in this secluded little valley, training his troops for 3.5 months in the summer and fall of 1859 for the raid on Harper's Ferry. It was nearly successful. He waits a little too long for some people to show up. He's captured. He's tried and hung. Before his hanging, he was interviewed by national and international magazines. They see the saneness, the rightness of his cause. As a result of John Brown's activity, the Union Army goes into battle with John Brown's name on their lips.
As the Civil War raged, the Hagerstown region became an epicenter of carnage. The city itself was ransomed by the Confederates. The Battle of Sharpsburg and Antietam was waged just miles away.
There on September the 17th, 1862, a battle will rage between the United States Army and the Confederate States Army that will involve nearly 120,000 Americans trying to kill each other. There are nearly 23,000 casualties on those quiet fields bordering the Antietam Creek. 23,000 casualties in 12 hours.
Antietam remains as the bloodiest day on American soil. After the Civil War, Hagerstown went back to work, and Jonathan Street began to prosper. Newly freed slaves mixed with long-time residents, and when they needed food or clothing or to get a haircut, they stayed in the neighborhood. A black middle class made up of entrepreneurs who catered to the needs of a community began to emerge.
Here was an area where everything you could want, you know, a hat shop or a shoe store, candy store, whatever, everything you could want was right there.
And there were the churches. Always the churches.
Quite a few black churches in this town. There was Zion, there was Ebenezer.
The AME Ebenezer Church that has been around since 1820, in their ledger, you would see how this church basically held court on deviant behaviors and how to deal with that through the church and within the community.
The music in those churches and hundreds of others across the country was provided by the Moeller Organ Factory, the largest organ manufacturer in the world, just up the hill from Jonathan Street. For decades, churches across America boasted of having a Moeller organ setting the standard for their worship. But the Moeller Organ Factory was not the only industry in Hagerstown. In the era between the end of the Civil War and the start of the Second World War, Hagerstown boomed, and the working-class city became the second largest in Maryland, outpaced only by Baltimore. At the intersection of railroads heading in any and all direction, Hagerstown became known as the hub city.
It was this great nexus where trains from Richmond and Baltimore and New York and Philadelphia all met on the way out to the Midwest.
In many ways, Hagerstown was very much like Baltimore, but in miniature. A blue-collar town, broad shoulders, and a pride in the products they produced. An industrial town filled with assembly lines and warehouses supplied by railroads, and a large African-American population that was looking for their piece of the American dream.
You know, in Hagerstown, if you drive a block away from Jonathan Street, you find beautiful, grand mansions. Well, the people who made those mansions work and tick and stay alive and maintained were the people who lived on Jonathan Street. They were the original essential workers of the 18th and 19th centuries.
Although many cities and towns across America had laws that restricted African-American movements after sundown, called sundown laws, Hagerstown did not, but practically speaking, the effect was the same. For years, Jonathan Street also benefited from the fact that it was the major north-south route, Route 11, between Pennsylvania and Virginia.
All the traffic passed right through the neighborhood. So when you had traffic through the neighborhood, people needed goods and services.
You know, you had the Harmon Hotel that was owned by Walter Harmon, the most affluent African-American that owned many properties within the community.
From 1880 to 1910, the population of Hagerstown almost doubled. Hagerstown's industrial might would be put to good use during World War I, supplying everything from aircraft parts to coal for the war effort. After the First World War, returning servicemen worked at businesses like Fairchild Aircraft and the Hagerstown Shoe and Legging Company. Some businesses began expanding operations. Moeller Organs, for example, began to manufacture automobiles. And some of that prosperity reached Jonathan Street as well.
So I love the pawn shop because it was pretty much a small Wall Street of trade that was happening within the community. It speaks to how they generated capital. how they worked through hard times, how that one business was the central kind of bank of the community.
Much of the money that was made outside of Jonathan Street returned to the community, and the wealth of the community grew slowly.
Machines do more and more of the hard work these days. For instance, here's the way they assemble the spokes and make the wheels for the Model
The
T Ford in
1920s were a
Highland Park,
boom time economically. Fresh from World War I, America's ability to make products and deliver them efficiently was unmatched. In no place was that more evident than Hagerstown. And as Hagerstown went, so went Jonathan Street. Although they were two distinct communities, they often intermingled in their day-to-day lives.
It's amazing if you look at Jonathan Street, like the maps of Jonathan Street, say in 1904, and then you look at the maps of Jonathan Street in the 1930s. You know, you got bowling alleys and, you know, all these things that cropped up within those 30 years.
In addition to the churches and the family, the other social structure supporting the collective advancement of the Jonathan Street community was education. The North Street School, a segregated school just off Jonathan Street, opened its doors in 1888. As the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties propelled Hagerstown ahead economically, entrepreneurs on Jonathan Street began to accumulate more and more.
Jonathan Street prospered in the early 1900s out of necessity because that was the only place that African Americans could live. They had no choice but to stick together and to survive and to build community and build business. And they were able to thrive.
But 6 decades after the last shots of the Civil War were fired, African American progress in America and in Hagerstown was still a mixed bag. For every step forward, there were oftentimes 2 steps back. Institutionalized racism largely kept African Americans from enjoying the same full spectrum of benefits that their white neighbors did.
I believe it was the 1930s, and Jonathan Street was developing a reputation for being the black community, which greatly offended the whites who lived further up Jonathan Street. And so they changed their name to Summit Avenue so they wouldn't be tarred with the same address that the minority was tarred with.
And an undercurrent of fear nagged even the most financially and politically successful in the community, who were well aware of incidents like the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, where 35 blocks of a prosperous community nicknamed the Black Wall Street were obliterated, killing dozens of residents and imprisoning thousands more. Or the Wilmington, North Carolina coup of 1898, where white supremacists overthrew a biracial, elected city government and killed more than 60 African Americans. Even on relatively peaceful Jonathan Street, the message was clear: don't get ahead of yourself.
1941, a date which will live in infamy.
America's industrial might and logistics expertise helped swing World War II to the Allied side. And Hagerstown did more than its share.
The Fairchild PT-19, which is a primary trainer, they built over 5,000 of those here, another probably 2,000 at other companies. Everyone that got their pilot's license through the military during World War II had to start in a primary training airplane, and the PT-19 was the predominant one for that time period. So, you know, everyone, even today, it's hard to find a person that grew up in Hagerstown that didn't have an uncle, an aunt, a father, a grandfather that worked at Fairchild, up to 10,000 people. And it stayed that way up through probably the early to mid-50s. And there's still a pride because of that today. So,
with my mother, for instance, working at Fairchild, and then some of her classmates and some of the other persons that she graduated with worked at Fairchild.
Boeing and Lockheed and those type of places were in very large cities. But Fairchild had more of a community feel to it because it was, you know, located in a small community of like 32,000 people.
Prosperity that was brought on by the war showed itself on the streets of downtown Hagerstown, which during the holidays often resembled the fictional town of Bedford Falls in It's a Wonderful Life. And outside of town, at Camp Ritchie, the famous Ritchie boys gathered intelligence on the enemy on a massive scale.
So in 1942, the U.S. Army created the Military Intelligence Research Center here at Ritchie because the United States had a little bit of a barrier where you could teach someone how to shoot a weapon very quickly, but you couldn't train someone how to learn fluent German in a few months. It's estimated that about 60% of all actionable intelligence was gathered by Ritchie boys.
Among the notable Ritchie boys were author J.D. Salinger and banker David Rockefeller. And although the U.S. military would not integrate until after the war, a small percentage of the Ritchie boys were Black, most notably William Warfield, an opera singer chosen for his facility with language. Warfield would become famous after the war for his rendition of Old Man River in the movie version of Showboat. Black people shared in the World War II prosperity to a lesser extent.
There was one factory that was specifically Black and African American, Plant 7. We do know that for sure. We have a large map that shows all the different factories and plants.
As the Allies piled up victories in Europe and the Pacific, white and Black servicemen and women contributed to the effort at home and abroad. As the war ended, the question became, would shared sacrifice also mean shared prosperity?
The Pittsburgh Courier, a Black newspaper, said, let's do the double V campaign. Victory in Europe over the Nazis, and then come back here, and it's finally going to be our time. And so they did fight in World War II, and they came back, and nothing happened.
After World War II, Hagerstown continued to be a blue-collar town. Though manufacturing slowed nationally, employers like Mack Truck, Moeller, and Fairchild still provided the bulk of jobs in Hagerstown. The GI Bill offered veterans the opportunity for college education and for home ownership. Thousands of formerly blue-collar workers were now being helped to reach the middle class. The largest upward social mobility movement ever was undertaken, as long as you were white. The Veterans Administration co-signed housing loans, but did not guarantee them. That allowed banks to restrict their loans to areas that had the least risk, which were overwhelmingly white, a process that became known as redlining.
They literally, on a map, drew lines, and one was red.
And those communities were difficult for people to get home loans. They were difficult for people to get business loans.
Part of it was because the mortgages would not be insured by the federal government as a result of redlining.
And right now, Jonathan Street is a redline community because it's part of Summit Avenue. Once the name of the street changes, you're going into a community that is predominantly African American, and you don't want to live there, and banks, you don't want to loan there.
Redlining was not confined to Hagerstown or Maryland. It effectively ruled out GI mortgages for almost all areas of the country that were largely Black. In New York, for example, more than 60,000 GI mortgages were given to white veterans. Fewer than 100 went to Blacks. Unable to access the capital needed to purchase or improve homes on Jonathan Street, over time, the area became less desirable.
Until we had the Fair Housing Act, you had these various schemes that were predicated on the fact that African Americans did not have access to traditional, regular prime mortgages. And unfortunately, what we've seen is all of a sudden throughout their neighborhoods, you would have this huge number of homes in foreclosure. They would fall into disrepair. And so they then had the negative collateral effect of reducing the property value of the folks who still had their homes.
For most American families, their home is their largest source of generational wealth, wealth that is passed on from parent to child. If the houses on Jonathan Street were losing value and new residents couldn't access the capital to buy them or to fix them up, then generational progress, the American dream that my child will do better than I did, was denied to the residents of Jonathan Street.
Well, we know generational wealth stems from home ownership and business ownership. One of the biggest resources is land and property, that you can pass down from generation to generation to create wealth. We take money from our homes to invest. We compound interest on that money. And compounding interest doesn't just happen in one lifetime, it happens generationally as well.
On Jonathan Street, the tight-knit community focused their attention on the next generation, especially as it pertained to education. The community was highly involved in the segregated local elementary school, the North Street School.
During that time, everything that we needed was right there in the community. We had our own stores, we had our own doctors, we all had our own dentists, we even had a chiropractor. So we as children saw those role models and said, you know what? We're going to aspire to be like these folks.
There were, of course, incidents between the races. In 1951, an amazingly talented young man from Alabama played his first professional game at Hagerstown's Municipal Stadium. 19-year-old Willie Mays was forced to stay by himself at the Harmon Hotel on Jonathan Street, the only segregated accommodations he faced during his entire career.
He goes to the Harmon Hotel in the Jonathan Street neighborhood of Hagerstown. His white ball players don't really understand what's going on. They're afraid that he's gone to some dangerous place. So 3 of his white new teammates come over to the Harmon Hotel just to see if he's okay. But as he goes out to play ball the next day, he's hearing the worst of epithets, the N-word, and treated roughly.
I guess about 50 years later, we decided we were going to make amends. And so we called up Willie Mays, who'd always kind of held it against Hagerstown, and said, look, this is not who we are. They're going to change the name of the street that ran past the stadium to Willie Mays Way. Well, wouldn't you know, right in the middle of it, some guy decides that he's going to protest and raise a fuss about changing the name of the street. And you could almost see that, Willie Mays just washing his hands of it and said, I tried, I'm done.
Willie Mays was not the only traveler, famous or not, to stay at the Harmon Hotel. It was one of the few games in town for Black travelers, located right on Jonathan Street, right on the major north-south thoroughfare running from Pennsylvania to Virginia. After the war, an organization called the Black Elks purchased the historic farm where John Brown planned his raid on Harper's Ferry. They erected a building on the property that became a concert venue for top African-American artists of the day.
These kids are coming to see James Brown, Fats Domino, Ike and Tina Turner, Marvin Gaye, the Coasters, the Drifters, just on and on, the giants of R&B.
They used to go up there and have big times out in there, dancing and a lot of other things, I guess.
Always packed. Yes, it was always packed, but everything they were busy dancing, eating. They had a stage. I remember the stage, but it was so crowded you couldn't even get to the stage.
They tell me it was a party place. They threw down there in more ways than one.
Young Black men and women from 3 states would make their way to the rural farm, dressed to kill. The concerts at John Brown's farm allowed young African Americans the freedom to interact outside of the microscope of the larger Hagerstown community.
It was different things that separated us from everybody else, and I guess they just felt, if you went to John Brown farm, that was something that they didn't have to worry about. It was something for them to do to relieve some of their tension.
In rare instances, the streets of Hagerstown did mirror scenes of racial violence in Detroit or Watts. Even when tensions didn't boil over, African Americans in Hagerstown still did live a separate and largely unequal life.
We weren't allowed to go we weren't allowed to swim in the swimming pool, being Black and being in that area there, and we weren't allowed to go into the Henry Theater.
You weren't allowed to go into Henry Theater because it was white only. There was a theater across the street from that called the Colonial Theater. I don't recall that we were allowed to go in that. We were allowed to go in the Maryland Theater, but we could only sit in the balcony at the time.
On Jonathan Street, community life continued to revolve around academics. Black principals, Black teachers, and Black parents pushed their students to excel, mindful that the world outside of Jonathan Street might not be so forgiving. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka that separate but equal education facilities for Blacks and whites were unconstitutional, and a national movement began to integrate public schools. Eventually, integration would come to the North Street School with unintended consequences.
When schools integrated, that really created a big problem for the Jonathan Street community. The difference in the expectation of African American students, when you compare it to what was happening at that school at North Street, was unbelievable. I went to South Hagerstown High School, and it was like I was a number. It was only about 6 or 7 of us. But we just felt so disenfranchised.
But the whites didn't really accept us. I guess that's the way, I mean, you know, we were always, I felt we were always talked about and how we were pointed at when we came out the bus. And it was just, but at that time, you know, that was just a way of life.
Around the United States, integrated schools led to white flight from urban areas to suburban areas. Low down payment government mortgages for white veterans set off a suburban building boom, and new highways and an American love affair with the automobile exacerbated the move out of cities. And new shopping malls filled with chain stores lured shoppers away from mom and pop shops downtown. In 1987, Route 11, the major north-south route in western Maryland, was rerouted to bypass Jonathan Street, devaluing businesses and homes in an already redlined community.
And what that does was out of sight, out of mind. If you don't see the deterioration of a community and you can circumvent it long enough, then you don't recognize it as it slowly deteriorates.
Oh, after the railroads were gone, the interstates came along, and Hagerstown was right in a crossroads. It was 70 and 81, and that everyone thought that was going to be wonderful. That was going to bring people here. They didn't realize that instead people were just going to zoom on past.
When the Valley Mall came in 74, that kind of crushed downtown. It took typical pattern, took the anchors, and in this case also was not on the city's tax base, so it wasn't even that trade-off. It was just a loss for the city.
We're a great hub. We have 2 major highways with I-81 and the 70 corridor that intersect right in the Hagerstown area. And the county has benefited from a lot of that because they've turned into a lot of hotels and shopping that you see along the highway lines. But those dollars hasn't transitioned into the city limits, which is our downtown area. And then you put 2 Walmarts, a Target and a Kmart. What does that do to your small business downtown?
In the late 70s, America's industrial economy began to sputter. Middle-class union jobs, the backbone of Middle America, began to move to less costly states or to other countries. Nowhere was that deadly phenomenon felt more acutely than in Hagerstown. From 1980 to 2005, the Hagerstown-Martinsburg census tract proportionally lost more blue-collar jobs than any other region in the country. And Hagerstown, always heavily reliant on manufacturing, didn't know how to cope.
And Hagerstown was dying. And in just that short amount of time, you were seeing plywood going up over the windows of the buildings downtown. Where there had been people, there were no people. You know, the places I remembered were going to seed. You know, 15,000 jobs all of a sudden were gone. And you think of the amount of wealth that generates for the community. And Hagerstown was going to need a second act.
A city and a region that had always prided itself on hard work and self-sufficiency was now taking hits from all sides. Fairchild, Hagerstown's crown jewel, would eventually pack up and move after a series of downsizing, contract losses, and battles with the city.
There was a lot of pain, a lot of anger. You had people who would drop out of school at the age of 17, go to work for Mack and Fairchild, and automatically be making more than their math and English teachers were at the school they had just left. When all of a sudden this birthright was gone, there was pain, there was anger, there was this desire to flail out and hold somebody responsible.
When I took over as county commissioner, president in '82, one of the biggest problems was the unemployment rate. We went up to 18 to 19% unemployment. We lost almost 10,000 employees from Fairchild.
A lot of husband and wives worked at Fairchild and Pangborn and Mack, so it was devastating to a lot of people.
It destroys your confidence. You know, you feel useless.
Desperate to lessen the impact of the job loss, the Hagerstown region became home to 3 prisons right outside of town, not far from the Antietam battlefield.
Communities that have lost economic activity in the past have been more open to having prisons put into their communities, as it turns out, because security guard jobs and similarly situated jobs pay good wages, you know? And so as a result, communities say, well, this is a job creator for us. You know, our people need to do something. They lost the job in the plant, and so what can we find for them? Well, how about in prison?
And those good-paying jobs for the prison's security guards come at a cost.
Once you get a police record, it's difficult to get a job. So you end up coming out doing the same thing that caused you to be incarcerated in the first place. There's not a support system available once you come out. We're talking about no hope.
We have to support individuals that are being reentered into society. We have to be able to provide the opportunities for them to be successful. But when we're having individuals reenter into society and just dropping them off at a homeless shelter with no connection to the community, no support system, no friends, no family, no anybody, we're setting them up for failure at that point.
We're not handling the addiction issues they have when they're going into prison. We're not handling the mental health issues they have. And then when we get out, we're $25 in a bus ticket and good luck. It's circular. You're in prison, you go out, you go back to prison. Recidivism, 75% over 5 years. We're completely failing as a country, and 82% of those folks are black or brown.
If you look at the data and you see the percentage of persons who are incarcerated, they look like me.
For those incarcerated inside the prison, there were no good-paying jobs. Maryland Correctional Enterprises, which provides what they call job training for inmates, pays inmates as little as 17 cents an hour for jobs like making furniture that is sold to state agencies and other buyers.
They make furniture, they produce meat, they make millions and millions of dollars. The pay is despicable. But the kind of jobs that they have really do not prepare them for what they need to be doing once they come out.
To the extent that we are using those inmates as competitive labor or human capital vis-a-vis private businesses, I don't view that as particularly a good idea. If you are causing industry decline because now you've got this captive workforce, which of course raises all kinds of ethical and moral issues, but if we just stick with the economics, it's still deeply problematic, potentially.
While offering good employment opportunities, they have put a tremendous strain on the relationships and inner workings of our community.
In the 80s, as jobs and residents fled the city center, downtown Hagerstown became a ghost town. And most bright young students were faced with a sad reality. There was not much of a future if you stayed in Hagerstown.
Unfortunately, in the community, Hagerstown, period, there's a big brain drain where a lot of their citizens in their youth, when they go to college, they actually leave the area and few return. Especially in the African-American community, most don't return because they believe that it's more of a reward not to return.
Community proved to be a ripe target for the crime and drug dealers when the crack epidemic gripped the nation in the 1980s. It became a magnet for outside dealers who could slip easily into the area from the crisscrossing interstates and could get higher prices in Hagerstown when they teamed with locals.
When I became mayor in 1998, we had an open-air crack cocaine drug market in that area.
You can't get through the 80s and 90s without talking about the epidemic of drugs and just substance abuse. And it took a toll on a lot of people in our community. And it was a symptom of a larger problem, perhaps, in terms of access to well-paying jobs, access to education, beyond high school.
And the local prisons could supply a steady stream of drug workers, newly released and desperate for money.
And I could see the change coming. I mean, I could see the older people complaining about outsiders.
And the community, of course, self-redlined because when you have fear instilled in you, even our local media made headlines about what happens on Jonathan Street. And crime can happen anywhere else in the community, and the address isn't as prominent as it is when crime happens in a redline community.
When you say tough on crime, you might as well be saying tough on blacks. When you say a war on drugs, you might as well be saying a war on blacks. And that's where a lot of the fractures began to show up. I don't think these politicians that came in and started making social issues race baiting, you might call it, I don't think they were necessarily racist themselves. But they found a very expedient way to win elections. And so maybe more than being racist, they were cynical. So, tell me which is worse.
Jonathan Street, a model of prosperity and African American self-sufficiency for so long, was staggering. And Hagerstown, a city of broad shoulders and strong work ethic, needed to start relying on wealthier parts of the state for help.
Thank goodness for Montgomery County, Baltimore County, and some of those, and Prince George's County, that they put into the tax base that we are able to appreciate back here. That's the same way with all Western Maryland. All of Western Maryland gets far more back than what they put in.
In the 90s, the suburbanization of Washington, D.C. reached Frederick, Hagerstown's neighbor to the south. Propelled by spending for biotech and pharmaceutical industries, Frederick's population surpassed Hagerstown's and his standard of living exploded. Meanwhile, the Hagerstown region was gripped by the opioid epidemic.
Unfortunately, when you have, kind of grinding poverty and a hopelessness, it is fertile ground for addiction. It's not the cause necessarily, because there's a lot of people who don't get addicted to opioids who live in poverty or places like Hagerstown or Baltimore for that matter, but it does make the issue worse.
And today, while Hagerstown's downtown often looks like this on the weekend, Frederick's downtown is filled with thousands of visitors every weekend looking at art or eating at dozens of restaurants, breweries, and distilleries that inhabit the town. In the 2000s, the indignities experienced by Hagerstown were put into sharp relief by the progress of its neighbors.
Everything just wound down. That's why our unemployment rate was at least twice as high as the national average, which was higher than the state average.
In the 2020 census, the population of Hagerstown earned, on average, less than half of the income of the entire state of Maryland. Almost 3 times as many residents live below the poverty line as they do in the rest of Maryland. Average home values are half of the rest of the state, and the number of residents with a bachelor's degree is less than half of that of the entire state. The question is obvious. What happened?
As you might expect, the people who were in charge politically were the ones that were blamed for it. The actual reasoning is probably some people blame regulation and taxes, other people blame corporate greed, and there's probably some on each side. I think really just the orders dried up, and that's what happened.
Not all of Hagerstown's problems were self-inflicted. The exodus of blue-collar jobs from America began in the 70s and was exacerbated by automation, the signing of the NAFTA agreement, and the movement of jobs to other states. To be sure, Hagerstown did enjoy some victories. Citicorp opened back-office operations outside of town in 1986. The Mack truck plant was taken over by Volvo. Although the number of workers has declined, Volvo has remained a steadfast employer in the community. But in Hagerstown, the progress was choppy. In 1995, the Base Closure and Realignment Commission, or BRAC, decided to close Fort Ritchie. The home of the Ritchie boys would be no more, and 3,000 jobs were lost.
The reasoning was that the Army believed it would save hundreds of millions of dollars by closing Ritchie. A few years later, a report did come out that they would only have saved a fraction of the cost.
Hagerstown has heroically tried to shake the rust off of its downtown. They spent millions refurbishing the Maryland Theater. Next door, the Barbara Ingram School for the Arts is considered one of the best high schools in the state. Around the corner, different branches of the University of Maryland system have a joint campus. The state of Maryland has pledged more than $70 million to build a new minor league baseball stadium within walking distance of Jonathan Street that it hopes will be an economic engine. Volvo has expanded their plant, and Hitachi is building a plant to house 500 workers building subway cars. Factories that once turned out airplanes and automobiles have been replaced by huge distribution centers for companies like Amazon, taking advantage of the hub city's web of interstates, but paying less in real wages than their predecessors did. And the local hospital, Meritus, has announced the construction of a new medical school that will bring hundreds of new doctors right outside of Hagerstown. But by and large, the majestic downtown buildings that once housed department and specialty stores stand quiet. And the attendant crime has forced some larger employers to relocate.
So we have a lot of conflict in this society. Creating safe environments is not easy. I'm not suggesting it is. And it takes expenditures and investment. But communities, whether it's City of Hagerstown or Washington County, have to be willing to make those investments because the rate of return on investment is very high.
And the city's politicians are paid at a rate that is less than minimum wage under the guise that their jobs are part-time. Mayor Takesha Martinez gets paid less than $30,000 per year for presiding over an annual budget of over $200 million. Former Mayor Bob Brucci made 3 times his mayoral salary selling used cars.
I'm in charge of a $200 million budget. I should be making $100,000 a year. Would she get reelected?
Well, first of all, no. She would not, or he would not get reelected. Facebook would blow up like you've never seen Facebook before. If a mayor, candidate, or a county commissioner promoted that, would they be reelected? Absolutely not. Probably escorted out of town.
So in the past 75 years, what happened? And more importantly, how can Hagerstown and the hundreds of Hagerstowns across America bounce back? In a special series of articles in late December of 2022, the Hagerstown Herald-Mail asked the same question and came up with no clear answers. Battered by years of plant closings and layoffs, of drug abuse and crime, many in the city have lost hope, which is why, when the Jonathan Street community went to bat for the little log cabin at 417, there were divisions and skepticism. And why, when the cabin was dedicated in the summer of 2021, it was looked on as a victory for the community and for historic preservation.
The lesson of the cabin isn't just a moral victory. It was a practical victory, and it was a psychological victory. I think those who do not know their past don't know their power. When you understand your DNA, when you understand the journey that our society has gone through, when you understand the fact that history has always been uneven, when you understand that, there's nothing in your future that should intimidate you.
That victory was extended when the Maryland state government granted $2.5 million to renovate the Robert Johnson Community Center, the old North Street School. In the summer of 2022, the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts staged an exhibit showcasing the history and contributions of the residents of Jonathan Street.
And I think that the log cabin is an eye-opener. This exhibit here is an eye-opener because it is the first time, since I can recall, ever, that this kind of display has been put out. People from our community are going to feel great about that. They are so excited about that log cabin. We're beginning to see a ray of hope. I feel that the more people really understand the history of Jonathan Street and of our community, the more they will be compelled to give the kind of hope that existed back in the 60s and the 70s where I grew up.
The little log cabin has symbolized the entire journey of the Hagerstown community, from its founder, Jonathan Hager, to the ownership of an African-American woman in the late 1800s, through the long residence of Richard Davis as a fixture in the community, and and, as of the close of 2022, the home to a young white couple.
At first, I was hesitant because I am a very white human being, but I am a firm believer that the country was raised by people of color. We wouldn't be here without people of color. This house has so much history behind it. And for a moment, I'm part of that history. So it's kind of my job to preserve it as much as possible and to let other people know, hey, this is the history of the home.
While bad things are still happening in Hagerstown, there are also good things happening. Can this small city regain its prestige and luster and hope? And years from now, when the history of Hagerstown is examined once again, will the positive changes be traced back to the little log cabin at 417? The house on Jonathan Street.
The House on Jonathan Street is made possible in part by a grant from the Hagerstown, Washington County Convention and Visitors Bureau. More information is available at visithagerstown.com. And in part by state funds from the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority in instrumentality of the state of Maryland. Additional funding provided by
Do you have a favorite hymn?
Yeah.
Can we get a little piece of it?
Yeah, you don't know like I know what he done for me. Oh, you don't know like I know what he done for me. Hallelujah, you don't know like I know what he done for me. Tell you, you don't know like I know. You don't know what he done for me. You don't know like I know what he done for me. You know what he did? He stopped my tongue from lying. What he done for me. Hallelujah. He stopped my tongue from lying. That's what he done for me. Oh, he stopped my tongue from lying. What he done for me. Let me tell you, you don't know like I know. You don't know what he done for me. You don't know like I know what he done for me. That's, thank you.